Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Saturday, October 15th, 2022, and we are nearly 3 weeks away from the 2022 midterm elections. And a lot of you guys have been asking, what is the driving motivation behind my estimation that Democrats are going to retain control of the United States Senate? Now, as of my most recent prediction, I thought that I had explained at least somewhat well enough across a number of states as to why I believed they were going in the direction that they will. But on a general basis, I wanted to address why Democrats are just simply likely to retain Senate control given the national circumstances, which are so unfavorable towards the Democratic Party. It isn't just an expectation, or an explanation, an explanation of why certain states are going to go to one side of the aisle. There are general themes that have emerged from the Republican Party, general candidate attributes that have really proven to be detrimental to the national GOP and their chances at winning back control. As we look at our Senate map here, Democrats are at a 50-50 tie right now with Vice President Kamala Harris. If you don't know this, the Vice President breaks the tie when it comes down to a Senate majority, and thus Vice President Harris breaks the tie and the Democrats retain control. Whichever party is in power actually ends up determining that in this specific circumstance. Now, looking at our map here, a 50-50 tie is not exactly something the Democratic Party would be extremely happy about, but they definitely would be happy in regards to retaining control of the Senate. This 50-50 tie also puts the Democratic Party in the narrowest possible majority that you can even have in a U.S. Senate. This is the narrowest it ever can be, and given historical context, Republicans should be at about a 99% chance of winning Senate control. To give you a bit more context in the past, to give you a better understanding as to what is going to be really the driving reason why Democrats are doing well now, is looking back at elections such as 2010 and 2014. The reason why I point these out is because these were big for what we call the Tea Party movement. Specifically in 2010, in 2014, it was more so a referendum on President Obama and not ushering a new type of conservatism, but rather continuing the already substantial House majority for the GOP and expanding on that in the U.S. Senate. Looking at our map here, this was the 2010 midterm elections, and you see a lot of red. And you see a lot of red for good reason. The Republican Party in this era went through what we had called as the Tea Party phase. It was a new wave of conservative ideology that was focused on traditional values, focused on economic prosperity, focused on everything you would associate with the Republican Party before Donald Trump. Now, that Republican Party wasn't always the one that was able to win. As you saw in different elections, including 2012, Mitt Romney was probably as close to a Tea Party type of candidate as you could have gotten, and yet he lost the presidential election. That type of conservatism didn't exactly translate to presidential victories, but it certainly translated to victories in congressional elections, and we saw it happen in the U.S. Senate. Looking at the election in 2008, this is where the Democrats were in the 2008 elections. Democrats were at a 59-41 majority. You heard that correctly, a 59-41 majority. Democrats were easily going to retain control of the Senate for likely years to come. But then 2010 came, and the Republican Party did significantly better than was expected. In 2010, the Republican Party picked up 6 seats across the U.S. Senate. Keep in mind, right now, what we are talking about is the Republican Party struggling to win just 1 seat. And the interesting thing about it all, we're working with the same exact Senate seats. 2010, 2016, and 2022 work with the same states. Yet in the 2010 map, the Republicans picked up 6 seats across the country. Very interesting, to say the least. But Democrats losing in these states was substantial. It was because President Obama was disapproved of on the national level and Republicans were doing well. Well, guess what? President Biden is doing worse than President Obama was. In fact, at this point in time, 12 years ago, that's crazy, 12 years ago, President Obama was down by 5 points nationwide and yet lost 6 Senate seats. In 2014, things got better for the GOP. Not only did they pick up seats, they flipped 9 seats in the U.S. Senate. In 2010, it was 6. In 2014, it was 9. Different Senate map, different pickup opportunities, sure. But on the general front, what we know from the Republican Party is that in Democratic presidential midterms, Republicans have done exceptionally well. And specifically under President Obama, who suffered worst favorability rating numbers. Actually, President Biden is doing worse than Obama was in these elections. And yet, the Democrats lost 6 seats in one, 9 in the other, and now Republicans are somehow struggling to win just 1. So where does this struggle come from? Well, I told you about the Tea Party movement. I told you about how that new wave of conservative ideology was honestly quite, and I didn't mention this, but it was quite popular across the country. Obamacare had passed. It looked like Democrats were taking advantage of the power that they had and went against public opinion because, quite frankly, Obamacare was not popular. Even though it is now, it was not popular at the time of passing. So when the Democratic Party pushed that through, many people realized that that was going to be one of the many nails in the Democratic Party's coffin for those midterm elections. But that energy continued until 2014. Then came in President Donald Trump, someone who won the presidential election despite everybody saying that he had no chance in hell at doing so. But with his new wave of ideology, opposite to the Tea Party movement, what worked on the presidential level did not exactly work on the swing state level. And when Donald Trump proved to Republicans on some front that his type of campaigning was electable, they thought it would translate through and through. And unfortunately for them, it did not happen and has not happened. It will not happen and has not happened, looking at historical context. Take a look at, for instance, Kelly Loeffler in the state of Georgia. She lost a Georgia runoff election, a race that went to the GOP in 2016 under this exact Senate map by double digits. Republicans who tried to replicate Donald Trump in swing races almost always have lost. And the reason is because that type of ideology might have worked in one presidential election, but failed in 2020, failed in the elections between 2016 and 2020, 2017 special elections, 2018 midterm elections, 2019 governor elections. Replicating and trying to embody President Trump as a swing state candidate does not always come to victory. And that is proving to be a huge detriment to these candidates this election cycle as well. Because I'm not the only forecaster here that has the Democrats winning control of the Senate. It's also FiveThirtyEight. It's also Decision Desk HQ. It's also Race to the White House. It's also JHK Forecast. It's also The Economist. The list goes on and on and on, and what they all agree on is that the Democratic Party is likely to keep their majority in the U.S. Senate. So, with all of that historical context, in addition to a lot more of the relevant data now, specifically what went wrong in these Senate elections, well, it's a lot. Starting off on the East Coast, we have three states that truly should have gone to the GOP quite easily, especially given historical election results and the circumstances of our national environment. We'll start with the big one, Pennsylvania. What went wrong here? Well, John Fetterman, as the lieutenant governor, he's the Democratic nominee. Him running was good for the Democratic Party. He's someone who has been across a statewide ticket before, and someone who, quite frankly, seems to appeal to voters better than some other Democrats who have tried, such as Hillary Clinton, or quite frankly, even Joe Biden. John Fetterman is a good candidate. But does that mean I think that he was unbeatable or unstoppable? And I still don't think he's unbeatable. Dr. Oz, the Republican nominee, still has a good chance. But the Republicans nominated someone who is far removed from Pennsylvania politics. And I just mentioned his name. You might know his name from the Oprah Winfrey Show. You might know his name from his own television show. You might know his name for all the reasons, but none of them having to do with politics. And that's the problem here. Dr. Oz was nominated across the state of Pennsylvania despite being a voting resident of the state of New Jersey. This was a big controversy in the start of the campaign, and quite frankly, Dr. Oz was never meant to be the nominee. Republicans had someone eyed up. They had someone lined up who received the Trump endorsement. His name was Sean Parnell, and he ran for Congress back in 2020, and quite frankly, he would have made this race likely Republican. But the problem was that he decided to leave the race early, and thus everybody was scrambling. Dr. Oz saw the opportunity, and he took it and won the nomination. Now he's facing off against a statewide elected official, facing off against the lieutenant governor of the state as someone who has no electoral history in any state, including Pennsylvania, who, quite frankly, is not even his home state. That's where the Republican Party messed up in Pennsylvania, but it didn't end just there. They also went with someone who has no experience in the realm of politics beyond finance in the state of Ohio. J.D. Vance, who started out as a never-Trumper, compared Donald Trump to literally Hitler when he talked about it in 2015, now embracing the Trump ideology, and yet now is falling behind. For context, Ohio is a state that Donald Trump won in both 2016 and 2020 by 8 points. So to see it even become remotely competitive is interesting. J.D. Vance did this to himself, and as a candidate simply is not the most electable Republican. If this was 2018, Tim Ryan would easily win this Senate race. Fortunately for J.D. Vance, it's not 2018, but the fact that this race could even be lost by a Republican is interesting, because in 2018, the Republicans won the governor election against a pretty strong Democrat. But in this case, J.D. Vance is such a poor candidate in terms of candidate quality and just campaigning efforts that it's easy to see how Ohio could vote against him if a different type of year was enacted. The state of Wisconsin, Senator Ron Johnson, just someone with a low level of approval, who will likely win re-election as we have expected for months now, but still someone who is holding on because of the circumstances of this election cycle. 3 people in 3 pivotal states, all of which diverting resources away from states that could use it more, states that realistically should not have been competitive, but yet are going to be competitive, yet are competitive in many, many ways. Let's continue down. The state of Georgia, this is a big one. Herschel Walker, does his name ring a bell? Well, Herschel Walker's name should ring a bell. He's a famous Georgia football player, played football in college, was in Football Hall of Fame, someone who was very well recognized across the state, but similar to Dr. Oz, not for political reasons. He was endorsed by Donald Trump, another ploy to try to have a celebrity type of figure win control of some type of seat, congressional, presidential, whatever it might be. But Georgia in specific has already rejected the Trump ideology not only in 2020, but in the 2021 runoffs that occurred 2 months later. Democrats, in fact, expanded on where they were in the November elections. Why? Because President Trump had a negative impact on those Republicans. And Herschel Walker, as this Republican who has numerous scandals, someone who has not run for political office on the statewide level, has not been able to be vetted or gone through opposition research in the way that everyone else has. And that's the problem here. Herschel Walker has so many scandals that is what is dragging him down. Because Brian Kemp, the Republican governor, is easily winning re-election at this point, at a 7 to 8 point margin over Stacey Abrams, someone who was floated potentially as Joe Biden's running mate in 2020. The state of Georgia right now is lean blue for one reason alone, because Herschel Walker is such a bad candidate. Heading over to the West Coast, the one thing that I will say before we get into Arizona is that Republicans did well in Nevada. They did well enough to at least potentially pick up this seat based off my expectation and many other people's as well. They only did this because Adam Laxalt was, quite frankly, one of the better GOP recruits of the cycle, but he's by no means perfect. But at the end of the day, being better than the rest of them is something to still at least recognize and treat as an accomplishment for the GOP. But neighboring Arizona, Blake Masters, similar to J.D. Vance, has no electoral experience. He's funded solely by Peter Thiel. You are talking about the direct representation of money in politics. And it's someone who, quite frankly, is so unpopular across the state because of stances that he takes, the way he campaigns. Altogether, Blake Masters is not an electable Republican. Almost everyone expects Arizona to be a blue state at this point, and Mark Kelly could have easily lost re-election had someone like Governor Doug Ducey ran. There were so many other opportunities that simply just fell through. So looking at these swing seats, you realize the Democratic Party lucked out in many ways, but it's because the Republican Party messed up their own election. The last state I will briefly mention is the state of New Hampshire, which should be grouped in with the swing states, but isn't because the Republicans didn't field anybody strong. Republicans had 2 prime candidates, the one being Governor Chris Sununu, who could have won this election blindfolded. But then you had the other person, the former Republican Senator Kelly Ayotte, who also refused to run for this election. Republicans are now pulling out ads out of New Hampshire and Arizona because they're realizing that some of these races are lost causes. At this point in time, the Democratic Party has an advantage because the Republican Party did this to themselves. Remember those 6 seats that were picked up? Those 9 seats that were picked up, and now Republicans are struggling to get just 1? Not only are they struggling to get just 1, but the expectations on the Democratic side, potentially speaking, is that they could pick up a seat from the Republican Party. 51 to 49, despite this being a year so vehemently against the Democratic Party. But honestly, that's yet to be seen. Right now, Democrats have the advantage for good reason. They have outflanked the Republican Party in more ways than one, especially when it comes down to candidate quality. And that's something the GOP is going to need to do a lot of introspection on in the future. Think about what went wrong this cycle, because quite frankly, they're not winning as easily as they could before. At one point in time, I thought the Republican Party, around a similar time last year, was going to win 54 seats over the Democrats. And obviously, that's not going to happen now. If the election was held last November based off of who we expected to be the candidates, how they were running, how they were campaigning, it would have been 54 to 46. But quite frankly, that is no longer the case. Right now, Democrats and Republicans are at 50-50. Democrats have the upper hand. Republicans still very well could win the majority, but Democrats are more likely than not, to retain Senate control. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2022 Senate election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.